So we'll be looking at an environmental health hazard case study, particularly around non-ionizing radiation in the form of radio frequency radiation. With the implementation of the fifth generation or 5G communication network across the world, there's a growing health concern around the increase of radio frequency electromagnetic fields, or RF EMFs, a form of non-ionizing radiation that will be present in the everyday environment. Recently, Brussels, which is Belgium's capital, have seen a lot of debate and protests from its citizens opposing the installation of the 5G infrastructure. The network uses a portion of non-ionizing radiation spectrum called radio frequency radiation and includes, but isn't limited to, microwave frequencies in the millimeter wavelength. This radiation range can have a heating effect to exposed tissues or other matter. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies the RF EMFs as possibly carcinogenic to humans. The fact that Brussels has halted the installation of 5G infrastructure based on the health concerns makes it very relevant to Australian citizens, as we have already embraced the technology in part, with arguably limited knowledge of the long-term health effects. The new level of radiation exposure to the individual is not yet quantifiable and will increase as more infrastructure and compatible devices are installed and used. This presentation will step through a health impact assessment of the radio frequency electromagnetic field associated with the 5G network in Brussels, and through broader research, we'll conclude with some relevant findings and recommendations. The health impact assessment itself is roughly broken into the scoping and screening sections, the appraisal, and the reporting and monitoring, where I'll give those recommendations. So let's start with the scoping section of the health impact assessment. We'll focus on the potential health impact of the proposed 5G network and the installation of the infrastructure in Brussels. It'll outlay the main potential hazards of concern within the population and assess the risks arising from these hazards from a likelihood and consequence perspective. We'll identify if or how other governments are addressing the same issues that Brussels is facing. On the right, there's just a screenshot of one of the news articles related to the environmental hazard that the population of Brussels are so concerned about. So for the appraisal, for many years people have been skeptical of all forms of radiation. It's been scientifically proven that ionizing radiation can cause human cell and DNA destruction and mutation. As the frequency increases, so does the risk of human health effects. Non-ionizing radiation is widely assumed by regulated bodies as less harmful because it only has enough energy to move or vibrate atoms within the molecule, but not enough to ionize the atom by removing energized particles such as electrons. So basically, they think non-ionizing radiation is enough to warm you up, but not enough to destroy your DNA or mutate your cells. Brussels tend to have a more conservative radiation exposure standard than other parts of the world. All countries at this stage have had the flexibility of creating their own standards based on how conservative they are. And some countries do a more evidence or science-based approach. Current clinical studies provide very little accepted evidence that non-ionizing radiation has a causative relationship with human morbidity or illnesses. There is one study of note where lab rats showed an increase in brain tumor rates after being exposed to high frequencies of non-ionizing radiation in high doses for prolonged periods. So the comments around that study that I have read online is that the rats were exposed to the absolute maximum frequencies that you'd expect from cell phones, and for much longer durations than would normally be expected for the average consumer. Continuing with the appraisal of the case study, the concerns of the citizens in Brussels are about the proposed 5G network as it will operate in frequencies that are at the higher end of the non-ionising radiation spectrum, higher than the normal networks that they've been using with the 3G and 4G networks. There'll also be an exponential increase of the number of antennas throughout their city with the aim of achieving 100% 5G coverage for businesses and residential locations. This will obviously increase as the individual frequency, duration, and intensity of the exposure to the radiation. It's difficult to convince the population that living in the 5G radio frequency environment is safe, given that there's no long-term data supporting their claim. And then they cannot accurately predict the levels of exposure because it'll continue to rise as more infrastructure and more devices are added. Adding to the skepticism, there are countless claims from ill people blaming the presence of non-ionising radiation. Erring on the side of caution, the World Health Organization has listed non-ionising radiation as possibly carcinogenic to humans. Other popular reports suggest that radiation causes a multitude of other ailments that indirectly lead to cancer, or that they are a possible co-founder to other morbidities. Other impacts on the community could include mental health issues related to stress and anxiety about the uncertainty of the health effects, socioeconomic decline from residents moving away from the city, education and employment opportunities. Now to the monitoring and reporting part of the health impact assessment. So during the rollout of the 5G network in Brussels and in the future, there needs to be an increased level of health surveillance to determine the relationship of the increased radiation and the community health status. The World Health Organization are developing documented strategy for the global harmonization of electromagnetic fields that includes these frequencies within the 5G network. They will still take several years to finish their recommendations, but it'll be a science-based paper that uses standardized terminology. They're also tasked with developing models that can be used for monitoring and compliance across the board. So in conclusion, because of the lack of consistency in the radiation exposure standards around the world and conflicting reports on the health effects, it's easy to understand why there are concerns around the concept of dramatically increasing the exposure to a given population. A lot of the research done on the non-ionising radiation is performed by the provider of the equipment, so some would tend to think it's a little bit biased. Individual governments are accepting the implementation of the 5G technology based on the limited but consistent information that non-ionising radiation is not harmful to humans. The World Health Organization is taking the time to conduct a science-based analysis of the hazard and have committed to supplying science-based critical guidance. But realistically, all interested countries should invest in the analysis so that they are part of the outcome, instead of waiting for an answer and then possibly objecting to it. The 5G network in Brussels and around the world should be put on hold until there is evidence-based acceptance for regulating standards. There also needs to be an agreed health surveillance program that feeds back data to support the future revisions of the standards.